Marcus Simmons was not your typical man in the world of business, but in many ways, that's exactly what made him extraordinary. He wasn't born into privilege, nor had he inherited a fortune. Instead, he had built his success from the ground up, quite literally. The proud son of a black farmer in a small town in the Midwest, Marcus grew up with a deep connection to the land. He understood the value of hard work, of long hours spent toiling in the fields, of waiting for the rain to fall just right and for the crops to grow. His father, who had endured his own share of hardship and racism, had taught him early on that perseverance was key in any battle, whether it was against the forces of nature or the prejudices of the world. Marcus's father had worked tirelessly to keep the farm in the family, a rare feat for black farmers in the face of systemic barriers. And while the farm had given Marcus a solid foundation, he had bigger dreams. He was determined to make a name for himself in ways that went beyond the boundaries of agriculture. Through his efforts in modernizing the family farm and his innovative partnerships with tech startups focused on agricultural sustainability, Marcus's net worth began to grow. His farm had expanded into a multi-million-dollar business, attracting attention and respect from industry leaders. But the more success he accumulated, the more he realized that his dream had evolved beyond the farm. Marcus wanted to travel, to break out of the small-town world he'd always known, to experience life on his terms. He dreamed of flying, not just on commercial airlines, but owning his own private jet. For Marcus, owning a jet was more than a luxury. It represented the ultimate freedom, a freedom that went beyond simply owning property or having wealth. It was about controlling his own destiny. He was tired of being restricted by schedules, airports, and the constraints of typical travel. With a jet, he could move at his own pace, across the country, and even the world. But beyond that, he hoped it would be a symbol, a testament to his success. After years of saving and planning, Marcus finally reached the point where he could afford the jet he had always wanted. He had done his research, meticulously combing through every detail of the various models available. After countless meetings with brokers, he selected the one he thought was the perfect fit, a state-of-the-art jet, sleek and luxurious, with all the modern amenities. The excitement was overwhelming. It was a dream come true. The dealership he had chosen was located in one of the most affluent areas, an upscale city where the elite came to buy their multi-million-dollar toys. For Marcus, stepping into that world felt daunting, but he had worked hard to get there. This was his moment. When the day arrived, Marcus drove in his sleek black SUV to the showroom, his mind racing with anticipation. The dealership was everything he had imagined: glossy floors, modern furniture, and pristine displays of private jets lined up like prized possessions. The showroom was quiet and air-conditioned, with the faint scent of new leather hanging in the air. The contrast was sharp between this world and the one he had come from, but Marcus was determined to make it his own. He wasn't just a black farmer now. He was a businessman, and he belonged here. As he walked through the showroom, a young sales associate approached. She was polite and well-dressed, with a professional smile. But as their eyes met, Marcus could sense something, a brief flicker of hesitation, an unspoken judgment that lingered in her gaze before it was masked by a smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to our showroom. How may I assist you today?" she asked. Marcus, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, extended his hand. "I'm Marcus Simmons. I've been in touch with your team. I'm interested in purchasing a jet." Her smile didn't falter, but the way her eyes lingered on him felt like an unspoken challenge. "Of course, Mr. Simmons. We have several options available. Let me show you our latest models." Marcus followed her through the showroom, looking at the various jets that lined the walls. He had already decided on the one he wanted, but he played along as the saleswoman spoke, outlining the various features of each model. He was ready to finalize the deal, eager to make his dream a reality. As they reached the back of the showroom, the sleek high-end jet that Marcus had been eyeing stood before him. It was everything he had imagined: polished chrome, modern features, and a luxurious interior. It was more than a machine to him. It was the embodiment of everything he had worked for. The saleswoman stood beside him, her voice more enthusiastic now, as she pointed out the finer details of the plane. "This is the latest model, Mr. Simmons," she said. "It comes equipped with the most advanced technology, satellite communications, a full entertainment suite, and custom leather seating. It's perfect for someone with your high standards." The word standards lingered in the air, and for a brief moment, Marcus wondered if she had meant it as a compliment. But he shook off the thought, choosing instead to focus on the jet. This was his moment. He had earned it. "I'll take it," Marcus said, cutting the conversation short as he handed over the necessary paperwork. "I'm ready to purchase." The saleswoman looked momentarily taken aback, but quickly regained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Simmons. I'll get the paperwork started right away." But before she could leave, the showroom manager, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stiff corporate demeanor, walked in. He exchanged a brief look with the saleswoman before turning his attention to Marcus. "I'm afraid there's been a slight complication," the manager said, his tone polite but unwelcoming. "We need to verify the financials once again before we can proceed." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Verify the financials?" he repeated, his voice calm but edged with confusion. The manager glanced at the saleswoman before continuing. "Yes, there seems to be an issue with the payment details. We just need to confirm everything with your bank before we can finalize the sale." Marcus's stomach sank. He was no stranger to financial transactions, and he knew his finances were solid. His bank account had been meticulously managed for years, and he had the necessary funds to make this purchase without a doubt. But there was something in the air, something he couldn't quite place, a sense that they were questioning his ability to afford such a luxury, simply because of the color of his skin. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't about money. It was about his identity. In a room filled with the ultra-wealthy, Marcus was the only one who didn't belong in their eyes. The humiliation was swift. "I assure you, the funds are available," Marcus said, but the manager had already turned away, not meeting his eyes. The saleswoman nodded with a forced smile. "We'll get this sorted, Mr. Simmons. Please bear with us." But Marcus wasn't willing to bear with them. He knew what was happening here. He wasn't just being questioned about his finances. He was being questioned because of who he was. A black man with enough money to buy a jet. A man whose presence in this space didn't seem to fit the narrative of those who were supposed to belong. With that, Marcus turned on his heel, his pride and dignity burning hotter than the frustration that simmered beneath the surface. He had worked too hard, too long, to let someone's prejudice steal this moment from him. Marcus Simmons left the showroom with his head held high, but inside, he was seething. He'd walked into that dealership with every intention of finalizing a deal he had every right to make, and yet, he was treated like an outsider, as if he didn't belong in the world of luxury and privilege. The cold air hit him as soon as he stepped outside. The sharp bite of the wind felt oddly refreshing against his skin, but it couldn't cool the anger building in his chest. He climbed into his black SUV, staring out the window at the glossy dealership in the distance. He had been humiliated, and not because of any mistake on his part. No, the only mistake was his presence in that space. A space where he wasn't supposed to be, at least not according to the unspoken rules of a world built on centuries of exclusion and privilege. As he drove away, the weight of the encounter settled over him. He had worked tirelessly to build his business empire from the ground up. He had earned everything he had, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though none of it mattered. The money, the success, the businesses he had built, all of it seemed to vanish under the harsh glare of prejudice. But Marcus wasn't the type of man to retreat in the face of adversity. He had learned long ago that standing up for yourself was the only way forward. He had faced racism in many forms throughout his life, on the farm, in business meetings, and in boardrooms where people doubted his ability because of his skin color. But this was different. This was a direct affront to everything he had worked for. They had doubted his worthiness not just because he was a black man, but because they couldn't fathom that a black man could afford such luxury. That night, Marcus sat in his office surrounded by papers, his laptop open to the bank's website. He pulled up the transaction history, confirming once again that the funds were more than adequate for the purchase of the jet. There was no issue with his finances. His wealth had been earned through hard work and legitimate business practices, and nothing in his account suggested otherwise. It wasn't about money. It was about race. It was the assumption, implicit but clear, that someone like Marcus could not belong in that world. But he was determined to make them see that he did, that he was more than the limitations they placed on him. The next day, Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces of power, luxury, and success. He contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in discrimination cases. A few hours later, Marcus found himself sitting across from Michael Howard, a seasoned civil rights attorney who had fought many battles like this one. Howard was a tall man with a sharp gaze, his office filled with bookshelves lined with legal texts and case files. The air was thick with the knowledge of decades spent in the trenches of justice. Marcus explained the entire ordeal, the visit to the dealership, the manager's behavior, the way the sales associate's attitude had shifted when she realized he was there to buy. Howard listened intently, nodding every now and then as he took notes. When Marcus finished, there was a moment of silence as Howard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "This is discrimination, plain and simple," Howard said, his voice firm. "They assumed you couldn't afford the jet based on your race. That is an actionable offense." Marcus felt a surge of relief, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a little. Howard continued, his voice steady and measured. "They've not only humiliated you, but they've also violated the Fair Housing and Equal Credit Opportunity Acts, which protect individuals from discrimination in matters of credit and business transactions. The law is on your side." Marcus's mind was racing. He had never envisioned that his purchase of a jet would lead to a legal battle, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a jet. This was about something larger, something deeper. It was about the racism that had been woven into the fabric of society for centuries, and it had manifested itself in that very showroom, in that very interaction. "We're going to take this to court," Howard continued, his tone unwavering. "But you need to be prepared. This is going to get messy. These companies have deep pockets, and they won't go down without a fight. They'll likely claim that this is all a misunderstanding, that their actions were just procedural, but we're going to expose the truth." Marcus's heart was pounding. He had come to this point in his life by fighting for everything he had, but this would be his biggest battle yet. As Howard outlined the next steps, Marcus knew that there was no turning back. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Marcus and Howard worked tirelessly to build their case, gathering evidence from the dealership, including the testimony of the saleswoman and the manager. Howard also sent subpoenas for the dealership's internal records, seeking any information that might reveal a pattern of discrimination. In the meantime, Marcus kept his business running smoothly. He had too much at stake to let his fight for justice interfere with his farm or other ventures. But the legal battle weighed heavily on him. He was determined to win, but there were moments when doubt crept in. Moments when he wondered if the system would ever truly change, or if his case would simply be another notch in a long history of disappointments. Then came the court date. Marcus walked into the courtroom, dressed in a crisp suit, his posture straight and confident. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was representing every person who had ever been made to feel less than, to feel like they didn't belong in a world they had every right to occupy. The courtroom was filled with tension. The dealership's legal team was ready, armed with arguments that would attempt to discredit Marcus and claim that the events of that day had been a misunderstanding. They would argue that there was no racial bias involved, that everything was simply a matter of protocol. Marcus sat in the front row, his thoughts clear and his resolve unshaken. He wasn't just fighting for compensation, he was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for the future, one where people like him could walk into any space, any showroom, any business, and be treated with the respect they deserved. The trial began. The courtroom was a blend of cold efficiency and heated emotion. Marcus sat in the front row, facing the judge's bench, his mind focused and sharp. It wasn't the first time he'd stepped into a room like this. He'd been in meetings, corporate boardrooms, and even local government hearings as part of his journey to build his business. But this was different. This wasn't a room filled with peers or business partners. This was a space where he was fighting against not just a corporation, but a system of exclusion that had been ingrained in the fabric of society for centuries. His attorney, Michael Howard, sat beside him, flipping through a thick binder of documents. Howard was a seasoned litigator, a man who had fought in numerous discrimination cases, but even he could feel the weight of this battle. He knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about a jet, it was about justice. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with the usual formalities. The judge, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, called the case to order. The opposing side, the dealership's legal team, was ready. They had a reputation for being aggressive, and Marcus knew they would stop at nothing to win. The dealership's legal team wasted no time in presenting their argument. They started with the claim that there had been no discrimination at all, just a simple error in the verification process. They argued that Marcus's financials had been flagged due to a routine check, a claim that seemed flimsy at best. The defense attorney, a polished woman in her early 40s, stood confidently at the podium as she began her statement. "Your Honor, my clients are in no way responsible for the situation at hand," she said, her voice smooth and unyielding. Mr. Simmons's financials were simply being processed in accordance with standard protocol. There was no racial bias involved in this transaction. Any implication of such an accusation is entirely unfounded. She turned to Marcus, a cold smile playing on her lips. "It's regrettable that Mr. Simmons feels slighted, but this was simply a business transaction that did not proceed as expected." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept his composure. He had heard these words before, and each time they stung. The attempt to downplay his experience was infuriating, but he wouldn't let them provoke him. Michael Howard stood up when it was their turn to speak. His voice cut through the tension in the room, confident and measured. "Your Honor, we are here today because a man was humiliated for no other reason than his race. The actions of the dealership were not simply an error. They were an attempt to exclude Mr. Simmons from participating in a transaction he had every right to be a part of." Howard paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. He then turned toward the judge, his tone turning more passionate. "Mr. Simmons is a successful businessman. He has built his empire from the ground up. His wealth is well documented, and his financials are beyond reproach. But, despite that, he was treated as if he didn't belong in the showroom, a showroom that was meant to cater to the elite, to those who are considered worthy of such luxury, and because of his skin color, he was made to feel like an outsider." There was a murmur in the courtroom, a ripple of discomfort as Howard's words hit home. He continued, laying out the facts, presenting the evidence of Marcus's financial stability, and exposing the subtle but clear racial bias behind the dealership's actions. He called on the saleswoman and the manager's testimonies, pointing out the discrepancies in their statements and highlighting the way Marcus was singled out. This was not an isolated incident, Howard argued. This was a direct result of a systemic issue, an issue that goes far beyond this one transaction. It's an issue that affects countless individuals every day, who are judged not for their character or accomplishments, but for the color of their skin. Marcus sat back in his chair, the words reverberating in his mind. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he could speak his truth, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been excluded or dismissed because of their race. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, the room fell silent. He stood up, his legs slightly trembling, but his resolve strong. He had been through many difficult situations in his life, on the farm, in business, and even in the face of racism. But standing in that courtroom, speaking his truth, was a new kind of challenge. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I never imagined I would be in this position. I've spent my entire life working hard, building something for myself and for my family. I came from nothing. My father was a farmer, and we struggled, but he taught me something important, that no matter where you come from, you should never let anyone tell you what you can or can't do. I've worked for every penny I've made, and I've earned the right to be in that showroom just as much as anyone else." He paused, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the judge. "When I walked into that dealership, I wasn't just there to buy a jet. I was there to claim what I had worked for. I was there to say, I belong here. And what happened to me? I was made to feel like I didn't, not because of my finances, but because of who I am." Marcus's voice wavered slightly as he continued. "I don't want this to be just about me. I want this to be about the future, about creating a world where people like me, people who have worked hard and earned their success, are treated with the same respect and dignity as anyone else. I don't want anyone else to ever have to walk into a place like that and be made to feel less than." The room was still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Marcus's testimony was powerful, raw, and unapologetic. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but this one was different. This one was personal. As he finished, he sat back down, his eyes focused straight ahead. He didn't know what the outcome of the trial would be, but for the first time, He felt a sense of pride. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for what was right. The rest of the trial proceeded with the usual back and forth of legal arguments and objections, but Marcus knew that his words had made an impact. Even if the road ahead was difficult, even if the case didn't go the way he hoped, he had already won in one crucial way. He had made his voice heard, and that, he realized, was the first step toward changing everything. The days after Marcus's testimony felt like an eternity. He had given everything he had in that courtroom, his truth, his dignity, and his sense of purpose. But now, as the trial continued, there was a lingering uncertainty. Despite the strength of his case, the powerful legal team representing the dealership had done everything they could to undermine his credibility. They'd called his emotions into question, attempted to paint him as an opportunist seeking to exploit a simple mistake, and insinuated that his accusations were merely a product of misunderstanding. But Marcus knew better than to give in to despair. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let the weight of the system crush him. He had always believed in justice, in the idea that right would eventually win out, though that belief had often been tested by the harsh realities of a world that didn't always work that way. The final arguments began to take shape. The opposing attorney, sharp and ruthless, leaned heavily into the narrative that this was just a simple procedural error. She presented the dealership's internal documentation, showing that they had followed every step of the verification process. They insisted that Marcus was simply mistaken in interpreting their actions, that any perceived bias was unintentional. But Michael Howard, Marcus's attorney, wasn't so easily swayed. He had been in these kinds of battles before, and he knew that the truth was on their side. Howard had already secured a key witness, the saleswoman who had been present during the initial meeting with Marcus. Through careful cross-examination, Howard had uncovered inconsistencies in her testimony. Under pressure, the saleswoman admitted that there had been a noticeable shift in her attitude when Marcus revealed that he was purchasing the jet. She did indeed seem surprised when Mr. Simmons walked in, Howard pointed out, and there was hesitation on her part to treat him as she would any other customer who was looking to make a large purchase. In fact, she admitted that she briefly doubted his ability to afford the jet, based solely on his appearance. It was a pivotal moment in the trial. The jury, composed of 12 men and women, seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats as the weight of that testimony sank in. The dealership's defense had been based on the idea that nothing about their actions had been discriminatory. But the saleswoman's admission revealed a deeper truth. Her doubt was rooted not in Marcus's financial situation, but in her assumptions about him based on his race. That was the turning point. The case was no longer just about a transaction gone wrong. It was about the systemic racism that had made Marcus's presence in that showroom feel like an anomaly. Something to be questioned, something to be scrutinized, simply because of the color of his skin. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense team tried to recover, but the damage was done. Their arguments seemed hollow now, like desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. The judge, a man who had presided over numerous cases, looked weary as he listened to the final remarks. Howard stood one last time. "Your Honor, this case is not just about one man's experience in a showroom. This is about a society that too often treats people differently based on their race, a society that assumes someone doesn't belong simply because they don't fit the mold of what success looks like. Marcus Simmons worked hard to build his empire. He has every right to be treated with the same respect as any other person who walks into a dealership to purchase a luxury item." Howard turned to the jury, his gaze steady. "The evidence is clear. The actions of the dealership were discriminatory, and Marcus Simmons was humiliated because of his race. We ask you to do what is right, not just in this case, but in a world that needs change. We ask you to hold the dealership accountable." Marcus watched as Howard spoke. The tension in the room felt unbearable, but he didn't look away. He had fought this battle with everything he had. He had stood tall, even when the world tried to make him small. And now, he could only wait. After the final arguments, the jury deliberated. The room seemed to hold its breath as they discussed the evidence, weighed the testimony, and considered the implications of their decision. Marcus couldn't help but replay everything that had happened, how it all started with his dream of owning a jet, how that dream had been shattered by the prejudices of others, and how he had refused to let that injustice define him. The deliberation took hours, each minute dragging on like an eternity. Marcus's palms were sweaty, his heart pounding. He had come this far, but he still didn't know how it would end. Finally, the jury returned. The judge's voice echoed through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom fell completely still as the foreman read the verdict. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Simmons. We find that the actions of the dealership were discriminatory, and we award the plaintiff damages for emotional distress and loss of reputation." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The words didn't immediately sink in. His mind was racing. This was real. He had won. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the news spread. The defense team looked stunned, their faces falling as they realized they had lost. On the other side, Howard shook Marcus's hand firmly, a smile on his face that spoke of victory, not just in this case, but in a fight for justice. The judge called the proceedings to a close, and Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the gravity of the decision wash over him. He had won not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for every person who had been pushed aside because of the color of their skin. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. The journey had been long, filled with pain and frustration, but it had been worth it. He had faced the system and come out on the other side stronger. But even as he celebrated this victory, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle. The world still needed to change. The work of breaking down systemic racism was far from done. But for today, Marcus allowed himself a moment of triumph. For today, justice had been served. The days after the verdict felt surreal. Marcus had won, but the emotional aftermath was more complicated than he expected. The victory in court was one thing. The media storm that followed was another. News outlets across the country covered his case as a pivotal moment in the fight against racial discrimination in luxury business transactions. At first, Marcus turned down most interview requests. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the focus to stay on the message. But over time, he realized that this was a chance to amplify his voice, not just for himself, but for others. He agreed to a few interviews, sharing his experience and his vision for a more inclusive future. "Racism doesn't just block opportunities, it denies people their dignity," he told one reporter. "I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. No one should be made to feel they don't belong because of their skin color." The interviews felt cathartic, and he began to understand the importance of using his platform to speak up. People began to reach out to him, individuals who had faced similar discrimination, who felt powerless in the face of systemic bias. They thanked him for speaking out, for challenging the status quo. It was overwhelming, but also incredibly validating. Marcus realized his case wasn't just about buying a jet. It was a catalyst for a larger conversation. But the road ahead wasn't without challenges. The dealership's legal team filed an appeal, hoping to overturn the verdict. The fight wasn't over. Marcus had won a battle, but the war for justice and equality continued. He remained grounded, determined not to let the appeals process shake his resolve. He kept pushing forward, refusing to be discouraged. Even as the appeals process unfolded, Marcus stayed focused on his businesses. His farm was thriving, his other ventures were expanding, but something had shifted within him. Before the trial, he had been content to focus solely on building his empire. Now, he felt a responsibility to use his success to make a tangible difference. He partnered with organizations focused on racial equality and justice, spoke at conferences, and mentored others in his community. But Marcus didn't want his advocacy to just be about his personal experience. He wanted to foster real change, changes in the ways businesses interacted with people of color, and changes in the way society viewed them. And then came the news he had been waiting for. The appeals court had upheld the original decision. The dealership had lost. It was official. Marcus stood in his office staring at the message, letting it sink in. The battle was over, and justice had been served. He had faced humiliation, doubt, and prejudice. But in the end, his voice had made a difference. But Marcus knew this was just one victory in a much larger fight. The struggle for racial equality was ongoing, and he wasn't finished. He would continue to fight for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the world at large. With his victory behind him, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work wasn't done, but now he knew that change was possible, and it all started with standing up, no matter the cost. If you want to hear more inspiring stories like this, then make sure to subscribe to our channel. Till then, goodbye.